I brought 24 red roses and first-class flight tickets to Paris to the Apex Innovations corporate office to surprise my husband for Valentine's Day. But the whole company was celebrating his engagement to the female CEO. My husband kissed her passionately, then held up a massive diamond ring as the crowd cheered. I turned around and walked away in complete silence. I instantly canceled the trip, froze all joint accounts, and withdrew my 83% share from the company worth $600 million. 30 minutes later, my phone showed 152 missed calls. Then my doorbell rang. Let me tell you exactly how you demolish a man who thinks he built you. Before I dive into the absolute destruction of Darren and his entitled family, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had to remind a narcissist exactly who signs their paychecks. The morning of Valentine's Day started perfectly. I woke up in our $5 million estate in the prestigious Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia. Darren, my husband of 5 years, kissed my forehead and told me he had a massive day at work. He was the vice president of sales at Apex Innovations, a tech startup that had exploded in valuation over the past 3 years. Darren always strutted around Atlanta, acting like he was the king of the corporate world, constantly reminding me that his job was high stress and high stakes. He thought I was just a freelance accountant who did basic tax preparation from my home office. He spent the last 5 years telling me I lacked the corporate killer instinct and needed to stay out of his professional life. He loved the narrative of the powerful black executive providing for his quiet, unambitious wife. I let him believe it because peace in my home was more important to me than inflating my ego. What Darren did not know, and what I had hidden behind layers of non-disclosure agreements and offshore corporate structures, was that I was the anonymous founder of Vanguard Holdings. Vanguard was the exact venture capital firm keeping Apex Innovations alive. I literally owned the air Darren breathed. I drove my custom black SUV to the Apex headquarters just before noon. I had planned the ultimate surprise. I navigated through the sleek glass corridors of the building holding the roses and the tickets to Paris. As I approached the main glass-walled boardroom, I noticed a massive crowd of employees gathered around. I stopped dead in my tracks. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, I saw Darren on one knee. He was holding the hand of Sasha, the CEO of Apex Innovations. Sasha was a woman who built her entire brand on weaponizing the Black excellence narrative, constantly giving speeches about female empowerment while secretly running her company into the ground. Darren slipped a stunning emerald-cut diamond ring onto her finger. Sasha pulled him up by his lapels and kissed him deeply. The entire boardroom erupted in applause and cheers. Pop went the champagne corks. I did not scream. I did not drop the roses. I did not shed a single tear. I just watched the man I cooked dinner for every night smile at another woman the way he used to smile at me. I turned around, walked calmly back to the elevator, and descended to the parking garage. The moment I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the quiet, loving wife died and the ruthless venture capitalist took the wheel. I picked up my phone and called David, my lead asset manager at Vanguard Holdings. I bypassed all pleasantries. I told David to initiate an emergency withdrawal of our entire burn rate fund currently allocated to Apex Innovations. David warned me that pulling $600 million without warning would trigger a corporate death spiral for Apex. I told him that was exactly the point. Next, I opened my banking application. Darren had a black card linked to my primary wealth management account, which he believed was just a standard joint credit card we shared. I froze it instantly. I canceled the Paris flight tickets, ensuring the refund went straight back into my private holdings. The drive back to my estate was the most peaceful 30 minutes of my life. I was not mourning a marriage. I was calculating a liquidation. I had spent years dealing with Darren's condescending tone, listening to his mother tell me I needed to step up to match his level, and enduring his brother constant bragging. I had funded their entire reality from the shadows. As I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my property, my phone began to vibrate violently. It was Darren. 1 call, 10 calls, 50 calls. By the time I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, the counter displayed 152 missed calls. I tossed my keys onto the marble console table and took a deep breath. Then a frantic, aggressive pounding echoed from the front door. The consequences of my financial strike had officially arrived on my doorstep. I walked slowly to the front door, the heavy pounding vibrating through the solid wood. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Darren stormed into the foyer, his face twisted in absolute rage. He was not alone. Flanking him was his older brother Terrence, the self-proclaimed golden boy of the family, and Brittany, Terrence's white wife. Brittany always carried herself with an unbearable sense of entitlement, using her proximity to my successful black husband and his brother to act like she owned the city of Atlanta. Darren did not even pause to take off his designer coat. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "What is wrong with you?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Did you mess with the bank accounts again? I just tried to pay a $15,000 champagne tab at the most exclusive restaurant in the city for a corporate lunch, and my card declined in front of everyone. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" The waitress looked at me like I was a beggar. I had to ask Terrence to cover it. Terrence crossed his arms, looking around my immaculate home with a smug expression. "You really need to get your finances in order," Jada Terrence said condescendingly. "Darren is a high-level executive. He cannot be dealing with declined cards just because you forgot to transfer funds from your little freelance accounting gigs." Brittany stepped forward, adjusting the collar of her expensive trench coat. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of the familiar passive-aggressive pity she reserved strictly for me. "Honestly, Jada, this is exactly why Darren needs a woman like Sasha to manage the big picture things," Brittany sneered, her voice dripping with weaponized concern. "You are just a freelancer working in your pajamas all day. You do not understand how real wealth operates. Sasha is a CEO. She knows how to manage capital. You should really let the professionals handle Darren's financial life before you ruin his reputation completely." I stood there perfectly still, letting their words wash over me. This was the dynamic I had endured for 5 years. Darren, the brilliant provider; Terrence, the supportive brother; Brittany, the enlightened sister-in-law; and me, the quiet, simple wife who was holding everyone back. Darren paced back and forth across the marble floor, completely unaware that I knew exactly who he was celebrating with. "I work 80 hours a week to provide this lifestyle for you, Darren," continued shouting so loudly, the veins in his neck bulged. "I carry the weight of a multi-million-dollar tech firm on my back. Sasha relies on me. The board relies on me. And you cannot even make sure the joint checking account has enough clearance for a business lunch. You are useless. I swear, if Sasha had not been so understanding about the card declining, my career could have been over today." He actually thought I was going to apologize. He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for me to shrink into myself and beg for forgiveness. He waited for me to scramble to the bank app and fix his little problem. I looked at Brittany, who was smirking, clearly enjoying the domestic dispute. I looked at Terrence, who was shaking his head in mock disappointment. And then I looked at Darren, the man who had just promised his life to another woman on my dime. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply turned around, walked over to my designer tote bag resting on the console table, and reached inside. I pulled out the crisp, thick envelope containing the first-class tickets to Paris. I also pulled out the glossy, high-resolution photograph I had paid a private investigator to capture through the boardroom window just hours ago. The investigator had sent it to my phone, and I had printed it in vibrant color at a luxury print shop on my way home. I walked back to Darren. I held his gaze with eyes completely devoid of warmth. "You are right, Darren," I said softly, my tone dangerously calm. "I do not understand how real wealth operates. Let me show you what I do understand." I dropped the Paris flight tickets onto the marble table. They landed with a soft slap. Then I dropped the photograph right on top of them. The image was undeniable. Darren on one knee holding Sasha, hand the massive diamond catching the boardroom light, their lips locked in a passionate embrace. The silence that fell over the foyer was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right before a bomb detonates. Darren's eyes darted from my face down to the table. He saw the tickets. He saw his name printed next to mine for a romantic Valentine's Day getaway. Then his eyes locked onto the photograph. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Brittany let out a small gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Terrence uncrossed his arms, his smug expression shattering instantly. Darren took a step back, his hands shaking as he stared at the photographic evidence of his betrayal. The $15,000 declined champagne tab suddenly made perfect sense to him. I watched his brain try to process the fact that his quiet, obedient wife had just caught him committing corporate and marital treason. The game was over, and I held the remote control to his destruction. Darren's breathing became shallow and erratic. He looked at the photograph, then up at me, then back at the photograph. The arrogance that had fueled his screaming match just moments ago completely evaporated. But true to his narcissistic nature, Darren's first instinct was not to apologize. It was to manipulate reality. Jada, wait, you do not understand what you are looking at. Darren stammered, holding his hands up defensively. It is a PR stunt. I swear to you, it is just a marketing strategy. Apex Innovations is preparing for a massive initial public offering next quarter. The board of directors told us that Sasha needed a stronger, more stable public image to attract traditional investors. They asked me to stage a fake engagement for the corporate newsletter. It means nothing. I let out a sharp, cold laugh that echoed off the marble walls. A PR stunt, I repeated, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of his lie. You bought a $200,000 emerald-cut diamond on my frozen credit line for a corporate newsletter. You kissed her like you were trying to inhale her soul for a marketing strategy. Darren, you are a terrible liar and an even worse businessman. Terrence immediately stepped forward, placing a hand on Darren's shoulder to physically support him. Jada, calm down, Terrence urged, using his deep, authoritative voice. You are being hysterical. Darren is telling the truth. Corporate environments are complicated. You cannot just jump to conclusions and ruin my brother's career over a misunderstanding. You need to think about the family. Before I could tear Terrence's argument apart, the front doors burst open again. Yvonne, my mother-in-law, marched into the foyer. Brittany had clearly been texting her frantically from the driveway before they walked in. Yvonne was a woman who draped herself in luxury brands to hide her deep financial insecurities. She worshipped her sons and viewed me as nothing more than an inconvenient placeholder until Darren found someone better. What is going on in here? Yvonne demanded, her eyes darting between the photo on the table and Darren's pale face. Brittany rushed to Yvonne's side, whispering fiercely into her ear. Yvonne straightened her posture, glaring at me with pure venom. She did not care that her son was cheating. She only cared that I was causing a scene. Pack your bags. Jada? Yvonne barked, pointing toward the sweeping staircase. I am sick and tired of your jealous, insecure behavior. Darren works too hard to come home to a woman who constantly questions his authority. Sasha is a real woman. She is a CEO who understands the sacrifices required for Black excellence. If you cannot support my son's ambition, you do not belong in his house. Get your things and leave before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. I stood in the center of the foyer, surrounded by the four of them. They had formed a unified front, ready to discard me to protect Darren's precious reputation. They truly believed I was powerless. They believed that because Darren paid the electric bill, he owned the castle. You want me to leave his house? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. Yes, Yvonne shouted, crossing her arms. You are nothing but a freelancer. This house belongs to my son. He earned it. Now get out. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator that had finally locked the cage from the outside. I turned my back on them and walked unhurriedly toward my private study just off the main hallway. I heard Darren muttering to Terrence, asking what I was doing. I approached the heavy steel safe hidden behind a bookshelf. I entered the code, pulled the heavy door open, and retrieved a thick notarized legal folder. I walked back into the foyer and tossed the folder directly onto Darren's chest. He scrambled to catch it before it hit the floor. Open it, I commanded. Darren's hands shook as he pulled the thick stack of papers from the folder. Terrence leaned over his shoulder to read the text. Yvonne and Brittany watched in confused silence. "That is the property deed to this $5 million estate," I explained, pacing slowly in front of them. "Notice the ownership details, Darren. Read it out loud." Darren swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. "It says the property is owned by Vanguard Real Estate Trust," he whispered, confusion mixing with the growing terror in his voice. "Exactly," I said. "Vanguard Real Estate Trust is a blind trust, and I am the sole exclusive beneficiary and controller of that trust. I bought this house in cash in full 3 months before we got married. I let you put the utilities in your name because it made you feel like a big, strong provider. Legally, Darren, you are a month-to-month tenant, and your lease just expired." Yvonne's face contorted in shock. "That is a lie," she screeched. "Darren pays the mortgage." "There is no mortgage, Yvonne," I snapped, silencing her instantly. "I bought it in cash. Every luxury car in the driveway, the furniture you are standing next to, the very marble under your expensive shoes, it all belongs to me. Darren does not own a single brick of this estate." Brittany gasped, grabbing Terrence's arm. Darren stared at the deed, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his arrogant skull. He looked around the massive foyer, realizing for the first time that he was merely a guest in a kingdom I had built. The illusion of his power dissolved into the cold, hard reality of my financial supremacy. I was not just kicking him out of a marriage, I was erasing his entire identity. Yvonne and Brittany were completely paralyzed by the shock of the revelation. The facade they had worshipped for 5 years had shattered into a million pieces. Darren's breathing grew heavy. He threw the property deed onto the floor and puffed his chest out, trying to reclaim a fraction of his lost authority. "You cannot do this," Darren yelled, stepping toward me with his fists clenched. "We are legally married. This is marital property. A judge will laugh in your face. You cannot just kick me out of my own home without a proper eviction notice." "I know my rights, Jada. I am staying right here, and tomorrow I am hiring the best divorce attorneys in Atlanta to take half of everything you have been hiding from me." I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed a single button on a pre-programmed security application. I had made a very specific phone call during my peaceful drive home from the Apex headquarters. "You do not have any rights to a property held in a pre-marital blind trust, Darren," I stated calmly. "But if you want to discuss eviction protocols, you can take it up with my associates." Before Darren could respond, the heavy oak doors leading from the kitchen swung open. 2 massive, heavily armed private security guards stepped into the foyer. They wore tactical gear with the Vanguard corporate logo stitched into their shoulders. I paid them extremely well to ensure my personal safety and property enforcement. They moved with silent, terrifying efficiency, positioning themselves between me and Darren's family. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" the lead guard asked, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. "Yes," I replied, smoothing down the front of my blouse. "These 4 individuals are trespassing on private property. Please escort them off the premises immediately. They are not permitted to take anything other than the clothes currently on their backs." Darren's eyes went wide with genuine panic. "Jada, are you out of your mind?" he screamed as the lead guard grabbed him firmly by the bicep. "You cannot just throw me onto the street. All my clothes, my watches, my work documents are upstairs. Any property left inside will be boxed up and shipped to your mother house by my staff next week." I instructed the guards, completely ignoring Darren's pleading. "Remove them now." The security guards did not hesitate. They physically turned Darren around and marched him toward the front doors. Terrence tried to intervene, puffing his chest out to defend his brother, but the second guard simply placed a massive hand on Terrence's chest and shoved him backward toward the exit. "Do not touch my husband!" Brittany shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. She tried to deploy her usual weaponized white tears, crying out that they were being assaulted, but the guards were entirely unfazed by her theatrics. They herded the entire family out the front door and onto the sprawling stone driveway. I walked to the threshold, watching them stumble out into the freezing Atlanta rain that had just begun to fall. Yvonne was slipping on the wet stones in her designer heels, cursing my name and screaming that God would punish me for disrespecting my elders. Brittany was frantically trying to shield her hair from the downpour, crying real tears now that her comfort had been stripped away. Terrence was shouting idle threats at the security guards who stood like stone statues at the doorway. Darren stood in the center of the driveway, the rain soaking through his expensive tailored suit. He looked pathetic, stripped of the corporate armor he used to intimidate everyone around him. "You are a monster," Jada, Darren roared over the sound of the freezing rain. "I will destroy you in court. I will take every penny of that trust fund. I will drag your name through the mud until you have nothing left. You hear me? You are nothing without me." I leaned against the heavy wooden doorframe, perfectly dry and perfectly unbothered. "I am everything without you, Darren," I called back softly, though I knew he could hear me. Just as Darren opened his mouth to scream another threat, his cell phone began to ring. The shrill corporate ringtone cut through the sound of the rain. Darren pulled the phone from his pocket, his hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. He looked at the screen, and I watched his shoulders tense. He answered it, putting it on speakerphone in his frantic state. "Darren, where are you, Sasha?" Voice shrieked through the phone speaker. She sounded completely unhinged, all her CEO composure entirely gone. "Sasha, I cannot deal with this right now," Darren yelled back. "Jada just locked me out of the house. I need to call a lawyer." "Forget the house," Darren, Sasha screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "We are ruined. The anonymous founder of Vanguard Holdings just triggered a hostile pull-out clause. They withdrew $600 million in funding 10 minutes ago. The bank accounts are frozen. The investors are panicking. The board is threatening to call the federal authorities. Apex Innovations is going to be completely bankrupt by morning. We are going to lose everything." Darren froze. The phone slipped slightly in his wet grip. He stared blankly at the speaker, the magnitude of Sasha's words crashing into his reality. He looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto mine, standing in the doorway of the $5 million estate I owned. He saw the cold, calculated smile on my face. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together in his arrogant brain. He realized exactly who the anonymous founder of Vanguard Holdings was. He realized he had just cheated on the woman who owned his entire universe. I raised my hand, gave him a small, sarcastic wave, and gently closed the heavy mahogany door, locking the deadbolt with a satisfying click. The war had officially begun, and I had already won the first battle. The morning sun hitting the tinted glass walls of the Apex Innovations headquarters did absolutely nothing to warm the freezing, suffocating panic inside the main executive boardroom. The air in the room was thick with nervous sweat, stale coffee, and the undeniable stench of corporate terror. 12 senior board members sat around the massive mahogany table, shouting over one another, their voices echoing in a chaotic chamber of financial doom. The company stock had plummeted a staggering 40% in pre-market trading. The industry rumor mill was churning at breakneck speed. $600 million had vanished from their operating accounts in the middle of the night, and nobody in the building knew why. The chief financial officer slammed his fist repeatedly against the table. He demanded answers right then and there. He demanded to know why Vanguard Holdings, the anonymous lifeline of their entire operation, had triggered an immediate and catastrophic capital freeze. At the far end of the room stood Darren. My husband looked entirely unrecognizable. His usually immaculate tailored suit was severely rumpled. His silk tie hung loosely around his neck, and his eyes darted frantically around the room like a cornered animal. Darren stammered. Darren made pathetic excuses. He blamed a glitch in the banking system. He blamed a bureaucratic delay with the wire transfers. He blamed everything except the actual truth. Beside him stood Sasha. She wore her signature crimson designer dress, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, projecting an image of absolute control that was rapidly fracturing at the edges. Sasha stepped forward, raising her hands to silence the panicked room. She utilized the exact tone of weaponized confidence she always used to manipulate her investors. She told the board to relax, forcing a wide, artificial smile. She told them this was simply a minor power play by a faceless entity trying to renegotiate favorable terms before their upcoming public offering. Sasha leaned over to Darren, covering the microphone on the table, and whispered directly into his ear. She told him not to worry. She told him she knew exactly how these rich, arrogant venture capitalists operated in Atlanta. Whoever this guy is, Sasha whispered, a sickening smirk playing on her glossy lips. I will charm him. I will walk right into his office, bat my eyelashes, speak the language of black excellence, and have that $600 million sitting right back in our accounts by noon. He is just another man with a fragile ego. I know exactly how to handle fragile men. I always get what I want. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding crack. The entire room went dead silent. Every single head turned toward the entrance. I walked through those doors wearing a flawless, custom-tailored ivory power suit that commanded absolute respect. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, creating a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. Clicking, clicking, clicking. Flanking me were three of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the city, their briefcases gripped tightly in their hands. I did not look at the stunned board members. I locked my eyes entirely on Darren. Darren's face turned the color of wet ash. His jaw dropped open. He lunged forward across the table, pointing a trembling finger at me. What is she doing here? Darren shrieked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. Security. Call security down here right now. This is a private executive meeting. She is just my bitter ex-wife. She is having a psychotic break. She is trespassing on corporate property. Get her out of this building before she ruins everything I have built. No one moved. The security guards standing by the door had already been briefed by my legal team downstairs. They simply crossed their arms and watched the spectacle unfold. I continued my walk toward the head of the table. The clicking of my heels grew louder in the silent room. Clicking, clicking, clicking. I stopped directly behind the large leather chair. Sasha stood frozen, her arrogant smirk sliding completely off her face, her mind desperately failing to bridge the gap between the lowly freelancer and the woman commanding the room. I placed my hands firmly on the back of the leather chair. I looked around the room, making deliberate, piercing eye contact with every single terrified board member. Good morning, employees, I stated, my voice smooth, loud, and echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. My name is Jada. You do not know me by my face, but you certainly know me by my capital. I am the anonymous founder of Vanguard Holdings. I am the sole owner of the $600 million investment fund that keeps the lights on in this building. I am the 83% majority shareholder of Apex Innovations. I watched the brutal reality hit them. I watched the color drain from Sasha's face. I watched Darren's legs visibly tremble. I watched their entire world crumble under the tremendous weight of my words. I was the money. I was the power. I was the executioner. Sasha slapped both her hands down heavily on the mahogany table. Her massive diamond engagement ring clattered loudly against the wood. You are lying, Sasha yelled, letting out a sharp, nervous laugh. This is a pathetic bluff. You cannot just withdraw $600 million overnight. It is illegal. You cannot pull funds without a formal 30-day written notice. It is explicitly written in the investment contract. You cannot do this to me. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick blood-red folder containing her absolute destruction. I slid the red folder smoothly across the polished mahogany table. It glided perfectly, stopping exactly an inch from Sasha's trembling fingertips. The boardroom held its breath. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the table, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the woman who thought she could steal my husband. Read Clause 4. My lead attorney, Marcus, stepped forward. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply opened the red folder, cleared his throat, and began to read the fine print that would dismantle Sasha and her entire career. Marcus projected his voice so every executive in the room could hear the exact legal terminology of their doom. He read that Vanguard Holdings retained the absolute right to trigger an immediate, unannounced withdrawal of all financial backing. He continued reading the clause detailing my right to initiate a hostile takeover of leadership in the event of gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, or severe moral turpitude by the executive board. Sasha crossed her arms, trying desperately to rebuild her shattered armor. She scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes at the board members, begging them to side with her. She said I was letting a domestic dispute ruin a thriving business. She paced behind her chair, raising her voice to command the room. She said I was a scorned, jealous wife who was throwing a temper tantrum because I could not keep my husband entertained at home. She used the words, "black excellence" again, claiming I was tearing down my own people out of spite. She told the board that my actions were an insult to every hardworking minority entrepreneur in Atlanta, and she threatened to take the story to the press to expose my supposed bitterness. I let her finish her pathetic monologue. I let the silence hang in the air for 5 seconds. Then I leaned back in my chair and smiled. I told Sasha that my ego was not tied to a mediocre man. I told her I did not care who Darren kissed in his free time. I cared about the $22 million in federal research and development grants that had magically vanished from the company balance sheets over the last 3 quarters. The chief financial officer dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. He stared at Sasha, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He stammered, asking Sasha what I was talking about. He swore to the room that the books were balanced at the last audit. I did not let Sasha answer. I took absolute control of the room. I detailed exactly how my private team of forensic accountants had spent the last 8 months quietly tracking every single digital transaction Apex Innovations made. I explained how Sasha and Darren had set up fake vendor accounts. They billed the company for non-existent software consulting services and imaginary code patches. They funneled the grant money through those ghost vendors and wired it directly into a private offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Apex Global Ventures. Sasha lost her balance. She gripped the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the mahogany wood. She stammered that those were legitimate expenses. She claimed the offshore developers were vital to their new product launch and that the accounting department simply misfiled the paperwork. She was drowning, and the entire board of directors was watching her sink without throwing her a life preserver. I stood up. I buttoned my tailored ivory jacket. I looked directly at Sasha and delivered the final blow. I informed her that she was no longer the chief executive officer of Apex Innovations. I was terminating her employment with cause effective immediately. I stripped her of her title, her stock options, and her massive severance package. I told her that my security team would march her to her office, watch her pack her personal items into a cardboard box, and throw her out the front doors like a common thief. The reality of the situation finally pierced through Darren's arrogance. He saw his wealthy, powerful mistress being reduced to absolutely nothing in a matter of seconds. He realized the corporate shield he had hidden behind was completely gone. Darren immediately backed away from Sasha. He literally put distance between himself and the woman he had proposed to less than 24 hours ago. Darren threw his hands up in surrender. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes. He swore he had nothing to do with the offshore accounts. He threw Sasha completely under the bus without a second thought. He claimed he was just following the orders of his chief executive officer. He said Sasha manipulated him, that she controlled the finances, and that he was just a simple vice president of sales who signed the papers she put in front of him. He begged me to believe that he was an innocent victim of her corporate greed. He took a step toward me, his voice cracking as he called me baby and reminded me that we were a family. He said he had been brainwashed by a predatory boss. Sasha turned to look at Darren. The absolute disgust on her face was almost poetic. She realized she had risked her entire career and her freedom for a man who would sell her to the authorities the second he was cornered. She spat at his feet, calling him a weak, spineless coward who could not even stand by his own criminal choices. I raised my hand to silence them both. The bickering of thieves did not interest me. I told Darren that his defense was incredibly fascinating. He claimed to be an innocent bystander who knew nothing about the money, but the forensic paper trail told a completely different story. I picked up a small black remote from the center of the table. I pointed it at the ceiling. The massive presentation screen slowly descended behind me with a mechanical hum. I pressed a button projecting a high-resolution, unredacted scan of the Cayman Islands incorporation documents for everyone in the room to read. I told Darren to read the names of the registered corporate officers out loud. It was not just Darren and Sasha hoarding the stolen $22 million. There were two other names listed as primary beneficiaries, each holding a 30% stake in the illicit offshore company. I watched Darren's eyes widen in absolute horror as he saw the names projected in massive black letters across the wall. It was his older brother, Terrence, and his entitled, condescending sister-in-law, Brittany. The entire family was in on the heist, and I had the paperwork to send every single one of them to federal prison. The sheer panic in Darren's eyes was almost intoxicating as he stared at the massive projection screen. Before anyone else could speak, the heavy glass doors to the boardroom burst open, slamming hard against the expensive frosted walls. Terrence and Brittany rushed into the room, completely ignoring the security protocol. Darren had clearly sent them a frantic, terrified text message the exact moment I mentioned the forensic audit warning them that their offshore piggy bank had just been exposed. Brittany took one look at the brightly lit screen, illuminating her name next to a stolen $22 million. Her survival instincts kicked in immediately. Her lower lip began to quiver. Her eyes instantly filled with large, dramatic tears. She clutched the lapels of her designer trench coat, her chest heaving as she let out a loud theatrical sob. She looked around at the stunned board members immediately attempting to play the fragile, innocent victim caught in the crossfire. Brittany cried out that she had absolutely no idea what those incorporation documents were. She swore she thought Terrence was just opening a small family savings account to prepare for their future children. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. She accused me of being a bitter, jealous woman who was bullying a vulnerable family just because Darren fell in love with a successful CEO. She sobbed to the room that I was trying to destroy innocent people out of pure, unadulterated spite, begging the corporate attorneys to believe that she was just a helpless bystander. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I stared at her with absolute freezing calm. "Save the tears, Brittany." I stated, my voice slicing through her fake sobbing like a scalpel. "They worked perfectly 3 years ago. When you backed your leased SUV into my custom Porsche, scratched the entire passenger side, and cried to Darren that the black valet driver did it. You let an innocent man lose his job just to cover your own incompetence. Your little victim routine worked then, but it does not work on federal wire fraud logs." I gestured to the screen behind me. I told her that the federal government tracks every single digital fingerprint. I informed her that my forensic accountants traced the exact IP address used to authorize 17 separate transfers from the Apex accounts directly into the Cayman Islands shell company. That IP address was registered to the luxury smart home she and Terrence bought last year. The same smart home she loved to brag about at every Thanksgiving dinner, claiming it was paid for by her husband's brilliant investments. Terrence's face flushed a dark, angry red. He stepped in front of Brittany, trying to project the image of a protective husband, but his hands were visibly shaking. He tried to raise his voice, demanding that my lawyers turn off the projector. He claimed the documents were entirely fabricated. He said I was trying to frame his family to stage an illegal corporate coup and steal the company from his brother. I laughed softly. I asked Terrence how he managed to purchase a $2 million yacht last month while simultaneously claiming to our family that he had been laid off from his logistics job. I asked him if he enjoyed his time on the water because the Securities and Exchange Commission was currently drafting the seizure paperwork for the boat, his house, and every single asset tied to his fraudulent name. The unity of their little criminal family shattered instantly. Darren screamed at Terrence, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He demanded to know why Terrence did not hide the digital transfers better, calling his older brother a careless, greedy idiot. Terrence shoved Darren backward, screaming right back that Darren and Sasha were the ones who got sloppy. Terrence yelled that Darren was pulling out millions at a time just to buy Sasha designer jewelry and fund their lavish secret vacations to Dubai. Sasha slammed her hands over her ears, screeching at both of them to shut up. She begged them to stop confessing to federal crimes in a room full of corporate executives and elite attorneys. The board members sat completely frozen in their chairs, their faces pale with horror, as they watched the leadership of Apex Innovations confess to a multi-million-dollar conspiracy in real time. My legal team stood quietly behind me, documenting every single word. I stood tall at the head of the table. I informed the four of them that my generous mood had officially expired. I gave them exactly 1 hour to clear out their desks and vacate the premises before I handed the unredacted audit files directly to the federal authorities. Brittany collapsed into one of the leather boardroom chairs. Her fake sobbing transitioned into genuine hyperventilating panic as the stark reality of federal prison set in. Darren fell to his knees. The arrogant vice president of sales was actually kneeling on the corporate carpet, begging me to keep this out of the courts. He pleaded that we could handle the money internally, insisting that since I had already taken the company, I did not need to take his freedom too. Before I could deliver my final verdict on their absolute destruction, a shrill, piercing voice echoed down the executive hallway. The security guards standing by the doorway were shoved aggressively aside. Yvonne stormed into the boardroom like a hurricane. She was wearing her oversized designer sunglasses indoors and clutching a crocodile skin handbag that I now knew was funded by my stolen capital. She marched straight toward the head of the table, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. She demanded that I stop terrorizing her boys immediately. She told the terrified board members that I was a deranged, unstable woman trying to ruin a beautiful family out of jealousy. Reaching into her expensive bag, Yvonne pulled out her cell phone and held it up like a weapon. She threatened to call every major press outlet in Atlanta right now and completely ruin my reputation if I did not back off and give Darren his company back. Yvonne did not wait for my answer. She reached a hand dripping with diamonds into her oversized bag and aggressively slapped a thick, bound legal document directly onto the polished mahogany table. The sharp smack echoed through the silent boardroom. She smoothed her hands over the cover page, her chest heaving with a mixture of exertion and undeniable arrogance. Yvonne looked around the room, making sure every stunned executive and terrified board member was watching her take control. She pointed a sharp manicured nail at the document. She told me I was not the only woman in Atlanta who knew how to secure her investments. She told me she had always known I was a calculating, cold-hearted woman who would eventually try to ruin her precious son. She walked around the table, standing directly behind Darren, placing her hands protectively on his shoulders. She commanded me to read the paperwork. It was a comprehensive, ironclad post-nuptial agreement. Yvonne proudly announced to the entire room that she had forced Darren to sign it 3 years ago, right after my design firm secured its first major international contract. She stated the terms with absolute gloating precision. If I ever filed for divorce, or if I ever attempted to initiate a hostile separation of our marital assets, Darren was legally guaranteed a mandatory non-negotiable $10 million payout. Furthermore, the contract locked me into paying him lifetime alimony at my highest earning tax bracket. Yvonne sneered, her lips curling into a wicked, triumphant smile. She told me I could take the company, but I could not touch her son without paying a $10 million ransom. She said I was trapped, and she demanded that I back down immediately before she bled my personal accounts completely dry. I did not touch the document. I did not even look at it. I simply looked at Marcus, my lead attorney. Marcus stepped forward. He did not open the binder. He did not need to review the terms. He looked at Yvonne with the same polite professional boredom he reserved for filing clerical errors. Marcus informed her that the document she just slapped on the table was legally worthless. He cited the exact penal codes and marital fraud statutes that instantly voided the entire agreement. Marcus explained slowly and clearly, so Yvonne could comprehend her failure, that any postnuptial contract is automatically nullified. The absolute second one party engages in felony financial crimes against the other. Marcus stated that Darren triggering a federal embezzlement investigation entirely breached the morality and good faith clauses required to enforce spousal support. You cannot enforce a contract funded by a criminal enterprise. You cannot demand $10 million from a spouse you are actively defrauding. Marcus looked down at the useless stack of paper and told Yvonne she might as well have brought a napkin to a federal court. The post-nuptial agreement was void. Darren was getting absolutely nothing. Nothing. Nothing at all. Darren buried his face in his hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing groan. He knew it was over, but Yvonne refused to surrender. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She slammed her hands on the table, screaming that my lawyers were lying. She yelled that she would hire her own legal team, the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state, and drag my name through a decade of litigation. She swore she would drain every single cent of my wealth in legal fees just to punish me for disrespecting her family. I held up my hand. The room fell dead silent. I told Yvonne that her threats were utterly meaningless because she was not going to have any money to hire a lawyer. She was not going to have any money to defend Darren. She was not going to have any money to defend herself. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a completely different folder. This one was bound in heavy black leather. I slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Yvonne. I watched her eyes dart toward it, her arrogant bravado faltering for the very first time. I told her to open it. I told her to look at the meticulously detailed financial ledger outlining the complete operational history of her pride and joy. Yvonne owned an upscale luxury boutique in the heart of Buckhead. It was her crown jewel. She spent every weekend parading around high society, hosting lavish champagne parties for Atlanta elite, bragging about her brilliant eye for fashion and her independent entrepreneurial success. She loved to tell everyone who would listen that she built the boutique from the ground up through her own hard work and impeccable taste. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I told Yvonne that the black ledger contained the exact routing numbers of her initial business capital. I revealed to the entire boardroom that the $500,000 seed money Yvonne used to secure the Buckhead lease, purchase the designer inventory, and host her grand opening gala did not come from a bank loan. It did not come from her savings. That $500,000 was the exact money Darren had embezzled from my firm's payroll accounts during the first quarter of last year. The blood instantly drained from Yvonne's face. Her jaw dropped and she stumbled backward, knocking into Darren's chair. She frantically shook her head, stammering that it was a lie. She swore she thought the money was a legitimate gift. She cried out that Darren told her it was a business loan from a private investor. She looked desperately at her son, begging him to tell the room that the money was clean. Darren would not look at her. He kept his face buried in his hands, completely paralyzed by his own cowardice. I did not let her breathe. I told her that ignorance is not a defense when you are dealing with stolen federal grant funds. I explained that receiving, depositing, and utilizing $500,000 of embezzled corporate capital officially made her a primary accessory to federal wire fraud and money laundering. I told her she did not build a business. She built a criminal laundering hub to wash her son's stolen cash. Yvonne began to hyperventilate. Her hands flew to her chest, her crocodile skin bag dropping to the floor. She begged me to listen. She promised to pay it all back. She swore she would liquidate the inventory, close the boutique, and wire the funds back to my accounts by the end of the week. She pleaded with me to keep this a private family matter, sobbing that her reputation in Buckhead would be completely destroyed. She begged me not to take her store. I slowly pushed back my sleeve and checked my custom diamond watch. I looked back up at her, my expression completely void of mercy. I told Yvonne that she misunderstood the situation. I was not taking her store. The federal government was taking her store. I informed her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had received my unredacted forensic audit at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her that at this very second, federal agents were pulling up to her upscale luxury boutique in Buckhead. They were smashing through the designer glass doors, locking down the registers, and seizing every single piece of stolen inventory she possessed. 7 hours later, the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel remained completely blind to the brutal corporate slaughter that had taken place that afternoon. The room was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over towering champagne pyramids, and tables draped in imported black velvet. A live string quartet played classical renditions of modern hip-hop tracks in the corner. This was the highly anticipated Atlanta Tech Gala. It was originally planned months ago to serve as the ultimate victory lap for Apex Innovations before their initial public offering. Now it was nothing more than a frantic, desperate telethon for survival. Sasha needed an emergency infusion of bridge funding by Monday morning, or the entire company would officially collapse under the weight of my capital freeze. Sasha was smiling. Sasha was nodding. Sasha was lying. She glided through the sea of wealthy investors and venture capitalists, wearing a blinding gold-sequined gown that fit her like a second skin. She gripped Darren tightly by the bicep, parading him around the room as her brilliant, devoted fiancé. Darren looked like a walking corpse. He was sweating. He was drinking. He was breaking. Darren knew his older brother was currently shredding hard drives in a panic. Darren knew his mother was currently sitting in a police precinct while federal agents boxed up every single designer handbag in her seized Buckhead boutique. The reality of his impending federal indictment was eating him alive from the inside out, but Sasha dug her manicured nails into his arm every time his fake smile wavered. She stood in the center of a circle of elite billionaire tech angels, projecting absolute weaponized confidence. She laughed brightly, tossing her hair over her shoulder as she spun her web of deceit. She told the investors that Vanguard Holdings pulling their funding was actually a mutual strategic decision. She claimed that Apex Innovations was simply restructuring its cap table to allow for more aggressive minority-led expansion. She used the phrase "Black excellence" 3 times in a single breath, expertly wielding corporate buzzwords to mask the smell of her own desperation. She pitched them on emergency bridge funding, promising them guaranteed massive returns once the imaginary restructuring phase was complete. The heavy brass-trimmed double doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open. The string quartet continued to play, but the collective breath of the entire room vanished. I stepped into the golden light of the gala. I was not wearing an ivory business suit anymore. I was wearing a custom backless emerald silk gown that moved like liquid glass across the floor. A flawless, vintage diamond choker rested heavily against my collarbone. I did not look like a discarded, heartbroken wife seeking closure. I looked like a sovereign arriving to inspect a conquered territory. The whispers started instantly. The elite investors in this room did not see Darren's bitter ex-wife crashing a party. They saw the ruthless anonymous titan behind Vanguard Holdings who had just liquidated a $600 million portfolio before breakfast. The sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns immediately parted for me. I walked straight down the center of the ballroom. Sasha spotted me from the VIP lounge, her golden, untouchable facade shattered into a million pieces. Pure, unadulterated terror flashed across her face before she frantically replaced it with venom. She snapped her fingers aggressively in the air, signaling her private security team to intercept me. Sasha lifted the hem of her gold gown and stormed across the ballroom floor, throwing herself directly into my path before I could reach the center tables. She hissed at me, her chest heaving, her voice trembling with unhinged fury. She demanded to know how I got past the velvet ropes. She pointed a shaking finger at the exit, telling me I was trespassing on a highly secure private corporate event. She purposely raised her voice just enough for the nearest circle of venture capitalists to hear her. She called me a pathetic, jealous ex-wife who was having a public mental breakdown because she could not handle being replaced. She accused me of showing up just to tear down a powerful, successful minority business out of pure spite. She looked at the 3 massive security guards closing in behind me and ordered them to physically drag me out of the building before I ruined a night dedicated to uplifting Black excellence. The 3 security guards stepped forward, reaching out to grab my arms. Marcus and my legal team instantly materialized from the shadows of the ballroom. Marcus did not yell. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out the venue ownership documents, and shoved them directly against the chest of the lead security guard. The guard looked down, read the letterhead, and immediately took 3 massive steps backward. The entire security detail stood down, refusing to lay a single finger on the woman who owned the holding company that paid the hotel lease. I did not dignify Sasha's pathetic insults with a single word. I did not even look at her face. I looked directly through her, as if she was nothing more than an annoying draft of wind in an otherwise perfect room. I smoothly stepped around her frozen, trembling body and glided directly toward the illuminated main stage. Sasha screamed for Darren to do something, but Darren was currently vomiting in a decorative planter near the bar, his nerves completely shattered by the sight of my legal team. I climbed the velvet steps of the stage. The hired DJ saw me coming and frantically tried to block the soundboard with his body. Marcus gave the young man one single freezing look. The DJ swallowed hard, raised his hands in surrender, and backed away from the table. I reached forward and gripped the main audio cord connecting the mixing board to the towering speakers. I ripped it out of the socket. The music died instantly. A sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback echoed violently through the massive ballroom, silencing every single conversation, every laugh, and every clinking champagne glass. I stepped up to the main microphone stand located in the dead center of the stage. I adjusted the height of the mic with a slow, deliberate scrape of metal. The entire room went dead silent. I looked out at the sprawling sea of panicked executives, confused billionaires, and a hyperventilating Sasha standing alone on the dance floor. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thud of my finger against the microphone amplified through the massive ballroom speakers, snapping the attention of every billionaire, venture capitalist, and tech angel directly to the stage. The murmurs died instantly. The clinking of champagne glasses ceased. I looked out over the sea of terrified and confused faces, letting my gaze sweep past Sasha, who stood frozen on the dance floor, like a statue made of cheap gold. I did not look at Darren. I did not mention Darren. To me, Darren was no longer a husband, a traitor, or even a man. He was simply a bad investment that I had already written off entirely. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I stated, my voice smooth, steady, and projecting absolute authority across the room. "My name is Jada. Many of you know me as the primary capital backer behind Vanguard Holdings. I am the reason you were invited tonight, and I am the reason you are all currently wondering if your portfolios are bleeding. I know you were just treated to an incredibly passionate speech about corporate restructuring and minority-led expansion. I am here to provide you with the actual financial forecast for Apex Innovations." I watched the elite investors shift uncomfortably in their tailored suits. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water. I kept my tone entirely professional, stripping away any hint of personal vendetta. I wanted to destroy Sasha not as a woman, but as an executive. I wanted to humiliate her in the only language these billionaires actually respected. Vanguard Holdings did not withdraw its $600 million backing as part of a mutual strategic shift, I announced, letting the cold, hard facts echo through the ballroom. We pulled our capital because the current executive team at Apex has spent the last 3 quarters embezzling $22 million in federal research grants to fund a private offshore shell company. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently seizing their assets, and the Securities and Exchange Commission will be filing formal indictments by Monday morning. Any venture capitalist who signs a bridge funding agreement tonight will be directly financing a criminal enterprise and will be subjected to the exact same federal audits. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Investors immediately pulled their phones out, aggressively texting their legal teams to cancel any pending transfers. Sasha let out a strangled, horrified shriek. She lunged forward, screaming that I was lying, begging the security guards to cut the microphone feed. No one moved. The room belonged to me. "But Vanguard Holdings is not retreating from the Atlanta tech sector," I continued, my voice easily overpowering her pathetic screaming. "We simply reallocated our capital to a leadership team that actually understands how to innovate rather than steal. I am pleased to announce that as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, Vanguard Holdings has officially acquired 100% of Vertex Solutions." The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. Vertex Solutions was Apex Innovations' biggest and most aggressive rival. They had the infrastructure, but they had always lacked the massive capital required to completely dominate the market. I had just given them a $600 million war chest. Sasha stumbled backward, her knees visibly buckling as she realized the magnitude of her destruction. I had not just ruined her company. I had bought the precise weapon that would erase her from the industry permanently. I did not stop there. I shifted my gaze from the wealthy investors in the VIP sections directly to the rows of tables in the back. I looked at the people who actually mattered. I looked at the lead software developers, the senior engineers, the project managers, and the coding architects who had been working 80-hour weeks to build the products Sasha was trying to sell. They were sitting in their rented tuxedos and modest evening gowns, watching their employment vanish before their eyes. To the technical staff of Apex Innovations, I said, my tone shifting from cold corporate titan to an aggressive recruiter. You are brilliant. You are the only reason this company had any value to begin with. You have been grossly underpaid, overworked, and manipulated by an executive board that was stealing the grants meant to fund your departments. Vertex Solutions is currently launching a massive expansion phase, and we require the best minds in the city to execute it. I gripped the microphone stand, leaning forward, speaking directly to the brilliant men and women sitting in the shadows of Sasha failure. If you stand up right now, walk out of those brass doors, and join my team at Vertex Solutions, I will match your current salary and immediately add a 30% increase. I will provide full premium healthcare benefits starting tonight. I will grant you the stock options you were promised but never received. You will work for a company with a fully funded, transparent ledger. But this offer is only valid if you walk out of this gala right now. Leave the criminals to sink with their own ship. I stepped back from the microphone. I let the absolute suffocating silence crash over the grand ballroom. For an agonizingly long 10 seconds, no one moved. The tension in the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Sasha let out a manic, desperate laugh. She spun around, pointing at her staff, demanding their loyalty. She screamed at them to stay in their seats. She threatened to blacklist every single one of them from the Atlanta tech industry if they dared to stand up. She promised them bonuses. She promised them promotions. She begged them not to abandon her. At the very back table, David, the lead architectural engineer, who had built the entire back-end framework for Apex, slowly pushed back his chair. The screech of the wooden legs against the floor cut through the room like a gunshot. David stood up. He reached up to his lapel, unpinned his gold-plated Apex VIP badge, and let it fall. It hit the floor with a quiet, dismissive click. He did not look at Sasha. He buttoned his jacket, stepped out from behind the table, and walked straight toward me. That was all it took. The dam broke completely. The senior database manager stood up next, then the lead interface designer, then the entire cybersecurity team. Chairs scraped against the floor in a massive synchronized wave of defection. One by one, badges clattered against the expensive hotel flooring. Dozens of engineers, developers, and managers stood up, turned their backs on their screaming, hyperventilating chief executive officer, and walked out the door. Within seconds, 80% of the workforce was gone, leaving Sasha standing completely alone in a sea of empty tables. The sheer gravity of the mass exodus hung in the grand ballroom like a thick, suffocating fog. The heavy brass doors clicked shut behind the last departing engineer, sealing Apex Innovations' fate. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in absolute shock. Then the absolute chaos erupted. It was a spectacular, unhinged stampede of the elite. The billionaire investors and venture capitalists did not politely excuse themselves. They scrambled. Cell phones were whipped out of tuxedo pockets with frantic urgency. The sound of rapid dialing and panicked, hushed commands replaced the elegant string quartet. I watched as men and women who controlled global markets aggressively barked orders at their wealth managers and bankers, demanding immediate stop payments on every single check and wire transfer initiated to Sasha that evening. Term sheets were physically ripped in half. Handshakes were violently retracted. The illusion of black excellence and minority-led expansion was dead, replaced by the glaring radioactive neon sign of federal fraud. Sasha was drowning in real time. She lunged toward a prominent Silicon Valley angel investor, her gold-sequined gown catching the chandelier light as she desperately grabbed his forearm. She pleaded with him to listen, swearing that my announcement was a malicious lie, a staged stunt by a bitter woman. The investor looked at her hand on his jacket as if it were coated in poison. He violently yanked his arm away, his face twisted in pure disgust. He told her she was a walking federal indictment and ordered her never to contact his firm again. Sasha stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing without sound, entirely stripped of her arrogant armor. But the true collapse was just beginning. Through the panicked crowd of retreating investors, Brittany emerged. She had clearly rushed to the St. Regis straight from the disastrous boardroom meeting earlier that afternoon. Her usually flawless designer trench coat was wrinkled. Her expensive blowout was disheveled, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. Brittany had spent the last 7 hours processing the grim reality that the FBI was currently seizing her Buckhead boutique and dismantling her entire fraudulent life. She had come to the gala praying that Sasha and Darren would secure the emergency bridge funding to magically pay off the stolen capital and make the federal agents disappear. Instead, Brittany walked in just in time to watch the investors flee and the bridge funding vanish into thin air. The final escape hatch was slammed shut. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She was going to federal prison. Her husband was going to federal prison. They were going to lose the smart home, the yacht, and every single cent they had stolen. Her self-preservation instincts violently hijacked her brain. Loyalty evaporated. Family ties shattered. Brittany locked eyes with Darren, who was leaning heavily against a cocktail table, his face a pale, sickly shade of gray. Brittany did not care about the remaining billionaires in the room. She did not care about corporate decorum or preserving the family name. She marched directly into the center of the ballroom, her heels striking the polished floor like a gavel. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Darren's face. Her voice tore through the murmuring crowd, a shrill, hysterical shriek of pure panic and betrayal. She screamed that she was not going down for his pathetic, sloppy mistakes. Brittany shrieked to the entire room that Darren and Sasha were the architects of the entire embezzlement scheme. She yelled that they had deliberately forced Terrence into the operation, manipulating his access to the routing numbers to siphon the payroll capital into offshore accounts. She cried out that Terrence was just a pawn, a victim of his younger brother, greedy, insatiable appetite for stolen wealth. Sasha tried to intervene, stepping between them and demanding Brittany shut her mouth before she ruined them all. Brittany violently shoved Sasha backward. She screamed right into Sasha, face detailing every single illicit purchase. Brittany hollered that Darren was bleeding the company dry, just to fund Sasha lavish secret vacations to Dubai. She listed the diamond necklaces, the leased luxury cars, and the 5-star hotel suites, screaming that my stolen money paid for every single one of Sasha designer dresses. Brittany sobbed hysterically, dropping to her knees in the middle of the ballroom, begging anyone listening to believe that she and Terrence were coerced by a manipulative, thieving couple. The remaining investors stood frozen, their phones pressed to their ears, watching the leadership of Apex Innovations publicly devour each other. My legal team stood silently behind me, documenting the complete and utter destruction of my enemies. Darren was backed into a literal and metaphorical corner. The alcohol, the fear, and the absolute humiliation finally broke whatever fragile grip he still had on his sanity. His face flushed a dangerous, violent red. He stepped away from the cocktail table, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked down at Brittany kneeling on the floor, and he snapped. Darren screamed back at her, his voice raw and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He yelled that Terrence was a willing, greedy participant who took his cut without a single complaint. Darren screamed that he did what he had to do to keep the company afloat. He pointed wildly at the fleeing investors, yelling that none of them understood the pressure of maintaining a valuation that was completely fabricated. In his blind, unhinged rage, Darren lost complete control of his words. He screamed that the company was bleeding capital for months before the embezzlement even started. He shouted that he had to cover the massive, gaping losses. He threw his arms in the air and bellowed at the top of his lungs, accidentally confessing his greatest, most destructive secret to the entire ballroom. He screamed that he falsified every single line of the quarterly investor reports. He yelled that he faked the user acquisition numbers and fabricated the revenue projections because if he told the truth, Vanguard Holdings would have pulled their funding a year ago. A suffocating heavy silence immediately slammed down over the grand ballroom. The ringing echo of Darren's accidental confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Every single investor, every venture capitalist, and every remaining board member stared at him in absolute horror. Darren's chest heaved as he stood under the chandelier light. He slowly looked around the room, his eyes widening as the catastrophic reality of what he had just screamed out loud finally registered in his brain. He had just publicly admitted to massive systemic federal securities fraud. The absolute silence held for 3 agonizing seconds before the flashing strobe lights of the press cameras shattered the stillness. Reporters who had been invited to document Sasha's glorious triumph were now frantically recording the exact moment of her total destruction. Sasha slowly turned her head to look at Darren. The polished golden veneer of the tech visionary melted away, leaving behind a desperate cornered animal. Her chest heaved, the veins in her neck strained against her diamond necklace. She marched across the empty dance floor, the heavy sequins of her gown dragging behind her like chains. She did not yell immediately. She walked directly up to Darren, grabbed him by the lapels of his tailored tuxedo, and delivered a vicious, echoing slap across his face. The sound cracked like a whip through the ballroom. Sasha lost her mind. She screamed at him, her voice raw and jagged, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. She called him a pathetic, broke, useless middle manager who could not even commit a crime correctly. She shrieked that he was nothing before she picked him up, that he was a coward who had just destroyed her empire because he was too weak to handle the pressure. She yelled that she never loved him, that he was just a convenient, easily manipulated stepping stone to secure her funding. She demanded that the investors look at her, swearing she had no idea the books were cooked, attempting to throw Darren entirely under the bus to save her own skin. Darren touched his stinging cheek. He looked at the woman he had stolen $22 million for. The woman who had just publicly humiliated him and discarded him the second his usefulness expired. The last remaining thread of his dignity snapped. If he was going down, he was taking her straight to the bottom of the ocean with him. Darren grabbed a microphone off a nearby cocktail table. He turned directly to the row of hungry journalists recording every second. He pointed straight at Sasha and told the press to write down every single word. He shouted that Sasha was the biggest fraud in Atlanta. He exposed her entire carefully crafted self-made persona, screaming that she had never coded a single line of software in her life. He told the reporters that she stole her initial patent from a college roommate, paid off her early critics with hush money, and explicitly ordered him to manipulate the user acquisition data to secure the Vanguard Holdings capital. He yelled that her entire luxury lifestyle, the sports cars, the penthouse, the lavish parties, was entirely funded by the money he embezzled from his own family. He looked right at the cameras and stated that Sasha was nothing but a parasite wearing a designer gown. Sasha lunged at him again, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at his face, shrieking for him to shut up. The remaining board members watched in absolute horror as their chief executive officer and their vice president physically brawled on the floor of the St. Regis ballroom. I did not stay on the main floor to watch them wrestle in the dirt. I walked up the sweeping velvet staircase to the VIP balcony overlooking the ballroom. I stood by the carved mahogany railing, the cool glass of a champagne flute resting comfortably in my hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage reserve, letting the crisp, dry taste wash over my tongue. I watched the pathetic, violent circus unfolding below me. I looked down at Darren. His tuxedo was torn. His face was scratched and bleeding. He was scrambling on his knees, desperately trying to shield his face from the flashing cameras while his mistress screamed obscenities at him. I remembered a Tuesday evening exactly 4 years ago. I had been sitting at our kitchen island surrounded by blueprints and financial projections for my design firm. I had just secured my first minor commercial contract, and I was exhausted but glowing with pride. Darren had walked in, tossed his briefcase onto the counter, and looked at my meticulously organized paperwork with a patronizing, condescending smirk. He had poured himself a drink, patted me on the head like a child, and told me to temper my expectations. He had laughed and told me to stay in my lane. He said the real business world was meant for sharks, not decorators, and that I should just be grateful I had a successful husband to provide for me while I played with color swatches. I took another sip of my champagne, tracing the rim of the glass with my thumb. Look at your lane now, Darren. I thought, watching him cower on the floor while the elite investors of Atlanta recorded his ultimate ruin. You wanted to swim with the sharks, but you never realized you were just chum in the water. I built my empire with my own 2 hands in the dark while you were busy playing king of a stolen castle. You thought I was weak because I chose peace over conflict. You never understood that my silence was not submission. It was preparation. The screaming match on the floor suddenly cut off. The flashing lights of the press cameras momentarily ceased. The heavy, ornate brass double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom did not just open. They were shoved violently apart, slamming against the expensive frosted glass walls with a deafening crash. A tactical line of federal agents stormed into the room. They wore dark windbreakers with the bright, unmistakable yellow letters of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, fanning out across the exits and sealing the ballroom. The lead agent, a tall, severe-looking man holding a thick stack of manila folders, marched directly toward the dance floor. He did not look at the billionaires. He did not look at the press. He walked straight up to the crumpled, bleeding forms of Sasha and Darren. He raised a piece of paper in the air, his voice booming over the dead silence of the room, announcing that he held active, immediate federal arrest warrants for wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. The concrete walls of the federal holding facility were painted a sickening shade of institutional green. Darren sat alone at a scratched stainless steel table, shivering in his tailored tuxedo. The silk lapels were torn and dried blood flaked along his jawline from his violent scuffle with Sasha. The adrenaline of the gala had completely evaporated, leaving nothing but the crushing, suffocating weight of absolute ruin. The federal agents had stripped him of his shoelaces, his belt, and his custom platinum watch. He was no longer the brilliant vice president of Apex Innovations. He was federal inmate number 4092. A stern agent opened the heavy metal door and placed a standard-issue telephone on the table. He informed Darren he had exactly 3 minutes for his one legally mandated phone call. Darren did not call a high-powered criminal defense attorney. He knew every elite lawyer in Atlanta required a 7-figure retainer, and his bank accounts were currently frozen solid by the federal government. He did not call his mother, who was likely sitting in a similar interrogation room across town. He picked up the heavy plastic receiver and dialed the only person he believed he could still manipulate. He dialed my private cell phone number. I was standing on the terrace of my penthouse looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline when my phone vibrated. I saw the institutional caller ID. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, tapped the screen, and placed the phone against my ear. I did not say a word. I simply listened to him breathe. "Jada, please do not hang up," Darren begged, his voice cracking with manufactured desperation. He sounded like a terrified child. He launched into the performance of a lifetime, weeping into the receiver with loud theatrical sobs. He told me he was sitting in a freezing cell, terrified and completely alone. He begged me to listen to him, swearing on his life that he had made a catastrophic mistake. Darren desperately spun his web of lies, throwing Sasha completely under the bus. He cried that Sasha was a manipulative, toxic sociopath who had brainwashed him. He claimed she had poisoned his mind, feeding his ego until he could not see straight. He swore she forced him to falsify those documents, threatening to destroy his career if he did not comply. He painted himself as a tragic victim, a man who got caught in the crossfire of a greedy woman ambition. He begged me to post his bail. He pleaded with me to send Marcus down to the precinct to represent him. He lowered his voice to a desperate, intimate whisper, promising that if I saved him, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He swore he would completely cut ties with his family, leave Sasha to rot in prison, and dedicate every waking second to earning back my trust. He told me I was his rock. He told me I was the only woman he had ever truly deeply loved. I let him cry. I let him beg. I let him exhaust every single drop of his pathetic, manipulative energy. I waited until his sobs died down into pathetic, heavy pants. "Are you finished, Darren?" I asked, my voice as smooth and cold as polished ice. "Jada, please, you have to believe me," he whimpered. "I love you. I was just confused. She blinded me. But you are my real wife." I did not raise my voice. I did not express an ounce of anger or betrayal. I simply picked up a secondary tablet resting on my patio table. I tapped the screen and held the speaker directly against my phone microphone. Darren stopped breathing as a crisp, clear audio recording began to play. It was a digital wiretap pulled directly from the security servers in his private office at Apex Innovations. It was captured exactly 6 months ago. Through the phone, Darren heard his own arrogant, booming laugh echoing back at him. He heard Sasha giggling in the background. Then he heard his own voice deliver the killing blow. "Come on, Sasha," the recorded version of Darren scoffed. "You know I do not love her. I only married Jada because she was safe, quiet, boring, and easy to manage. She is just a placeholder until we get this company public. She does not have the spine to ever challenge me." I stopped the recording. The silence over the phone line was absolute. I could practically hear Darren's heart stop beating inside his chest. The manipulative tears instantly dried up. His entire victim routine was obliterated by his own recorded hubris. He was trapped in a concrete cell listening to the echoing proof of his own cruel, calculating arrogance. He tried to stammer, tried to form a sentence, tried to claim the audio was altered or taken out of context. I cut him off. "You are not getting Marcus," I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal freezing register. "You are not getting bail. You are going to be assigned a severely overworked, underpaid federal public defender. And you should probably know that I just officially forwarded that exact audio clip to their office email. I wanted your new lawyer to know exactly what kind of safe, easy-to-manage man they are representing." I did not wait for his response. I tapped the red button on my screen. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the glass table and looked out at the city lights. Miles away, inside a freezing, windowless interrogation room, Darren sat completely frozen. He slowly lowered the plastic receiver from his ear, listening to the hollow, empty dial tone. There were no more lies to spin. There were no more victims to manipulate. There was only the cold concrete floor, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the deafening absolute silence of his cell. The drive from the heart of the city to the manicured sprawling suburbs of Alpharetta took exactly 45 minutes. 45 minutes of smooth, uninterrupted silence inside the leather-lined cabin of my car. I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my messages. I simply let the quiet wash over me, savoring the absolute stillness that comes right after a violent storm. I had orchestrated the collapse of Apex Innovations. I had dismantled Darren's life. I had watched the federal agents drag him out of the St. Regis ballroom in handcuffs. Now, there was only one loose end left to tie up. I pulled onto the familiar tree-lined street and brought my car to a slow, deliberate stop across from Yvonne's sprawling brick estate. The pristine magazine perfect image she had spent a lifetime cultivating was completely gone. The front yard was an absolute disaster zone. It was a graveyard of manufactured wealth. Cardboard boxes were piled haphazardly against the pristine white columns of the porch. Designer garment bags were spilling out onto the driveway, their expensive contents exposed to the night air. Federal seizure notices were slapped against the windows of her 2 luxury SUVs. The feds had not just raided the corporate offices, they had swept through the family's assets like a hurricane. They had seized Yvonne's high-end boutique in Buckhead, freezing her accounts, seizing her inventory, and locking the doors on her entire fraudulent lifestyle. I stepped out of the car. My heels clicked softly against the pavement as I walked up the long, sweeping driveway. Yvonne was standing in the middle of the chaos, clutching a stack of velvet hangers and sobbing hysterically into her phone. Her normally immaculate hair was a tangled mess. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked up, her panicked eyes locking onto me. She dropped her phone. It clattered against the concrete, but she did not even blink. She did not express shame. She did not show a single ounce of remorse for the millions her sons had stolen or the empire of lies she had helped them protect. Instead, she operated on pure, unadulterated entitlement. She marched toward me, her face twisting into a mask of desperate rage. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest and began to scream. She demanded that I call my lawyers. She demanded that I open my checkbook. She demanded that I fix the catastrophic mess her family had created. "You have to pay for my defense!" Jada Yvonne shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria as she aggressively grabbed my forearm. They locked me out. They took my inventory. "You have the Vanguard money. You have the capital. You cannot just stand there and let them do this to me. We are family. You owe us family loyalty. You have to show some forgiveness." She demanded forgiveness. She demanded loyalty. She demanded salvation from a woman she had spent years trying to destroy. I looked down at her hand gripping my coat. I did not pull away immediately. I let her feel the cold, absolute stillness radiating from me. I let her see that her panic meant absolutely nothing to me. Her tears were irrelevant. Her desperation was irrelevant. Her pathetic pleas for family loyalty were entirely irrelevant. I slowly reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a thick, crisp legal envelope. Yvonne's eyes widened. A desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope flashed across her tear-stained face. She reached for the envelope with trembling hands, practically snatching it from my grip. She thought it was a lifeline. She thought it was a blank check, a retainer for a high-powered defense attorney, a magical solution to make the federal agents disappear. She ripped the flap open and pulled out the heavy watermarked documents. She stared at the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. The hope vanished from her eyes, replaced by a deep, suffocating horror. It was an official, court-mandated eviction notice. Yvonne looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Her hands shook so violently the paper rattled in her grip. 3 years ago, Yvonne. I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. 3 years ago, when your boutique was hemorrhaging money and this estate was 30 days away from foreclosure, a private holding company stepped in and bought your mortgage. You thought you got lucky. You thought a faceless corporate entity saved you. I am the primary shareholder of that holding company. I bought your debt. I bought your mortgage. I stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. I owned the walls. I owned the roof. I owned the very floor she was standing on. You have not paid rent to that holding company in 3 months. I continued my words, striking her like physical blows. You defaulted on your lease. You drained your accounts because you were secretly funneling your money directly to Terrence to help cover up the massive holes in Darren's fraudulent ledgers. You bankrolled a federal crime on my property, using my leniency to keep your sons out of prison. Yvonne's knees visibly buckled. The reality of her total destruction crashed down upon her. There was no secret wealth left to save her. There was no Vanguard capital coming to the rescue. There was only me. She dropped the eviction notice. The paper fluttered onto the driveway, landing among the discarded designer bags and cardboard boxes. Yvonne let out a strangled, agonizing wail and collapsed. She fell directly to her knees on the hard concrete. She grabbed the hem of my coat, weeping uncontrollably, begging me not to do this. She sobbed that she had nowhere to go. She cried that her reputation was ruined, that her business was gone, that she was an old woman who could not start over. She pleaded for mercy. I looked down at her. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the cold, hard satisfaction of a closed ledger. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises, I told her, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving whisper. If you are not gone by Wednesday morning, the Fulton County Sheriff Department will physically remove you and the locks will be permanently changed. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Buckhead Cafe, catching the steam rising from my double espresso. It was a pristine, quiet Tuesday. the kind of mourning reserved for women who had their lives entirely under control. I sat at a corner marble table, dressed in a sharp ivory pantsuit, reviewing the final acquisition documents for Vertex Solutions. The total dismantling of Darren, Sasha, and Yvonne had been executed with flawless precision, but I knew the fallout was still radiating through the city. I did not have to wait long for the next tremor. The heavy glass door of the cafe swung open, and Brittany practically stumbled inside. The transformation was jarring. The woman who usually glided through Buckhead wearing pristine Chanel and carrying herself with an air of untouchable superiority looked completely wrecked. Her signature blonde blowout was dragged back into a severe, messy knot. Her face was pale, devoid of her usual expensive makeup, and she was wearing oversized sunglasses to hide the terrified swelling around her eyes. She scanned the cafe frantically, her gaze locking onto me sitting in the corner. She did not wait for an invitation. Brittany marched over, pulled out the velvet chair across from me, and collapsed into it. She leaned heavily over the marble table, her hands trembling so violently that her gold bracelets rattled together. "Jada, you have to listen to me," Brittany pleaded, her voice a desperate, frantic whisper. She kept glancing over her shoulder, paranoid that federal agents were lurking behind the espresso machines. "You have the power to stop this. You control Vanguard. You have the ear of the federal investigators. I know you do. You orchestrated everything last night at the gala." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. I did not offer her a drink. I did not ask her how she was doing. I simply stared at her, letting the cold silence force her to speak. Brittany swallowed hard, immediately shifting her strategy. She removed her sunglasses, exposing red bloodshot eyes, and decided to play the ultimate victim card. She leaned closer, attempting to manufacture a false, desperate sisterhood. "We are women in a ruthless man's world, Jada," Brittany whispered, her voice cracking with forced emotion. "You know exactly what it is like to be controlled by them. Terrence manipulated me. He financially abused me. I had absolutely no idea where that money was coming from. He told me it was legitimate venture capital. He forced me to put the boutique in my name to protect our assets from taxes. He used the patriarchy and his power as my husband to brainwash me into signing those routing documents. I was terrified of him." She reached across the table, trying to grab my hand. I pulled my hand back smoothly, resting it on my leather portfolio. "I can give them everything." Brittany continued, her desperation escalating into full-blown panic. "I will be your star witness. I will testify against Terrence. I will give the SEC every single password, every hidden ledger, and every offshore account routing number Darren and Sasha set up. I will hand them over on a silver platter. I just need you to call the federal prosecutor and arrange full immunity for me. Please, Jada. We have to stick together against these men." I looked at the woman sitting across from me. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated audacity she possessed to sit at my table and invoke sisterhood after years of subtle, calculated venom. "Are you entirely finished, Brittany?" I asked, my voice flat and completely devoid of warmth. She blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to read my expression. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the cool marble. "Let us take a walk down memory lane," I said, keeping my tone deadly quiet. "Let us talk about the country club dinner 3 years ago. The one where you loudly asked me if my natural hair was considered appropriate for corporate events. Let us talk about the charity luncheon where you told the other wives that Darren was so generous for financing my little interior design hobby, completely ignoring the fact that my firm was out earning his salary." Brittany flinched, the color draining entirely from her face. She tried to stammer out an apology, claiming she never meant it like that, but I cut her off instantly. "You spent the last 5 years making racially coded condescending remarks disguised as polite conversation." I continued my words, striking her like precise surgical cuts. "You looked down on me. You smiled to my face while treating me like a charity case who got lucky marrying into your husband's family. You thought you were the smartest woman in the room because of your privilege, Brittany. Now look at you." I watched the realization wash over her. The false sisterhood evaporated, leaving only the terrifying reality of her situation. You think you have leverage, I stated, shaking my head slowly. You think you possess some golden ticket that the federal government desperately needs. You do not. I bought the paper trail weeks ago. The FBI already has the offshore routing numbers. The SEC already possesses the shell company formation documents you signed with your own hand. They have the fake invoices you ran through your boutique to wash Terrence's stolen capital. Your testimony is completely redundant. You have absolutely nothing to offer me, and you have absolutely nothing to offer the federal government. Brittany let out a quiet, strangled gasp. Her chest began to heave as a full panic attack set in. She covered her mouth, her eyes darting around the cafe like a trapped animal, realizing the cage was permanently locked. She whispered that she was going to a federal penitentiary. I unclasped my leather portfolio. I reached inside and pulled out a single sharply creased piece of printed paper. I slid it across the marble table, stopping it right in front of her trembling hands. Brittany looked down at the paper. It was not a legal retainer. It was not an immunity agreement. It was a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to a small rural town in the Florida Panhandle, the exact town she had desperately tried to erase from her history when she reinvented herself as a wealthy Buckhead socialite. The grand jury indictments are currently sealed, I told her, my voice dropping to a low, absolute finality. The federal seal will be lifted by a judge at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. That means you have exactly 12 hours to get on that bus and run back to wherever you came from before your face is broadcast on every major news network in the country. I picked up my espresso cup and took one final deliberate sip. If I were you, Brittany, I would stop crying and start packing. They do not allow designer luggage on the bus. The ink on Sasha's bail release papers was barely dry before she sprinted directly to a microphone. She knew she was facing decades in federal prison, and in her narcissistic, desperate mind, the only court that could save her was the court of public opinion. Less than 24 hours after walking out of the Fulton County Detention Center, she booked an emergency exclusive interview on one of the most heavily streamed business and culture podcasts in the country. Sasha arrived at the studio looking like a manufactured martyr. She had stripped away the heavy designer logos and the diamond tennis necklaces. She wore a simple, unadorned white blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back modestly, her makeup deliberately minimal to highlight the dark circles of stress under her eyes. She sat across from the sympathetic podcast host and launched into the performance of a lifetime weaponsing every available stereotype to paint me as the villain. It is an absolute tragedy. What happens when a bitter, scorned woman cannot let go? Sasha told the host, letting a single, perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek. Jada could not handle the fact that Darren moved on. She could not accept that he found a younger, more innovative partner to help him build his vision. So she decided to burn down a massively successful Black-owned empire out of pure, unadulterated spite. She is destroying our community's legacy just because she is angry and jealous. She orchestrated this entire federal witch hunt to ruin us. She played the victim flawlessly. She claimed Darren was a visionary who made some minor accounting errors and that I had maliciously exaggerated them to the authorities. She painted herself as an innocent, supportive wife who was now being targeted by a vindictive ex. The podcast episode went live and immediately caught fire. Within an hour, the clips were trending across every major social media platform. My phone began to vibrate incessantly with notifications. People were taking the bait. The comment sections were filling up with thousands of people debating the story, many buying into Sasha's tearful narrative, calling me a hater, a saboteur, and a jealous ex-wife trying to tear down a successful Black business. My attorney Marcus called me immediately. He was furious. He demanded that we draft a massive cease and desist order and file a defamation lawsuit before the end of the day. He wanted me to post a reaction video to get in front of the camera and defend my name against her vicious lies. I declined. You do not fight a media circus with a gag order. You fight a media circus with irrefutable, undeniable receipts. I did not record a video. I did not shed a single tear on camera. I did not engage in a shouting match with a desperate criminal. Instead, I opened my laptop, accessed the secure legal server, and downloaded the complete 60-page forensic financial audit of Apex Innovations. Since the federal indictments had officially been unsealed that morning, the evidentiary exhibits were no longer protected by an ongoing investigation clause. They were legally eligible to become public record. I did not just leak the report, I weaponized it. I paid a premium service to host the unredacted document on a high-capacity public server. Then I forwarded the direct download link to every major financial journalist, every local news desk in Atlanta, and every prominent social media blogger who had shared Sasha's podcast clip. I made absolutely sure to highlight page 42. Sasha had not just been skimming corporate profits to fund her lifestyle. The audit revealed the exact sickening depths of her greed. Over the past 2 years, Sasha had used Apex Innovations to systematically apply for and receive 3 massive federal and state grants. These grants were specifically earmarked to revitalize underprivileged minority communities in South Atlanta. The funds were supposed to build youth technology centers, provide small business loans to local entrepreneurs, and fund community outreach programs. The forensic audit tracked every single cent of that specific community grant money. Instead of funding a single youth program, Sasha had routed the federal funds through 2 anonymous shell companies. The money emerged on the other side perfectly washed and was immediately used to purchase a matte black Mercedes G-Wagon registered directly in her personal name. The community outreach funds paid for a 6-week luxury villa rental in Santorini for her and her friends. The small business loan grants covered the exact invoices for 14 Hermes Birkin bags, a closet full of red-bottom shoes, and her custom diamond engagement ring. She had not just stolen from me. She had not just stolen from investors. She had stolen directly from her own community to fund her fake, glamorous Instagram lifestyle, and then had the absolute audacity to go on a podcast and use that same community as a shield. The internet reaction was instantaneous, brutal, and utterly apocalyptic. The court of public opinion moved significantly faster than the federal justice system, and the backlash was biblical. The very same comment sections that had been defending her an hour ago suddenly turned into a digital firing squad. Black Twitter completely obliterated her. Financial influencers broke down the audit line by line, matching the dates of the stolen community grants to the exact dates Sasha had posted photos of her new luxury cars and designer bags on her social media. They created side-by-side comparisons of the stolen funds and her lavish vacations. The evidence was bulletproof, and the public disgust was absolute. The podcast host who had given her a platform realized the catastrophic mistake he had made. Terrified of the massive career-ending backlash for supporting a woman who stole minority community funds, he panicked completely. The interview episode was scrubbed from YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts in a matter of minutes. 2 hours later, the host posted a highly emotional, unedited video from the front seat of his car. He was profusely apologizing to me and to his entire audience, claiming he was utterly manipulated by a sociopathic liar and promising to vet his guests more rigorously. Sasha's entire world vaporized in real time. Her brand partnerships publicly severed ties with her, releasing statements condemning her actions. Her remaining friends blocked her number and distanced themselves immediately. She was forced to deactivate every single one of her social media accounts to stop the endless flood of vitriol and death threats. She was left completely isolated, trapped inside a rented apartment she could no longer afford. Her reputation was universally destroyed, her finances were annihilated, and her desperate media play had only guaranteed that when she finally faced a federal judge, she would not have a single shred of public sympathy left to save her. The fluorescent lights of the Fulton County Courthouse were harsh, sterile, and entirely unforgiving. I sat perfectly upright at the plaintiff table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet, absolute authority. Marcus sat calmly beside me, his hands resting on a surprisingly thin leather folder. We did not need a mountain of paperwork to end this. The facts were already carved in stone. Across the aisle, Darren sat entirely alone. The federal freeze on his personal and corporate accounts meant that every elite, high-powered divorce attorney in Atlanta had abandoned him the second his retainer bounced. He was forced to represent himself, and the visual downgrade was spectacular. He was no longer the polished, arrogant executive who wore custom Italian wool and commanded boardrooms. He was wearing an off-the-rack wrinkled polyester suit that fit him poorly. Dark patches of sweat stained his underarms, and a continuous bead of perspiration rolled down his forehead. He kept frantically shuffling a messy stack of handwritten notes, his hands trembling so violently that the papers rustled in the quiet courtroom. The Honorable Judge Harrison entered and took her seat. She was a no-nonsense woman who had clearly already reviewed the filings. She looked over her glasses at Darren and instructed him to state his case for the record. Darren stood up. He gripped the edges of his table, trying desperately to summon the booming, authoritative voice he used to wield like a weapon. Instead, his voice cracked. It came out thin, reedy, and pathetic. He launched into a rambling, delusional monologue, attempting to play the ultimate victim of the patriarchy in reverse. He claimed that I was a bitter, vindictive woman who had orchestrated a malicious, calculated campaign to destroy his reputation. He told the judge that my financial independence was a weapon I had used to emotionally abuse and isolate him. He literally started sweating through his cheap suit jacket as he spun a fictional tale of my cruelty, completely ignoring his own federal indictments. Then he made his final, most audacious move. Your Honor, because my wife has maliciously destroyed my career and rendered me entirely unemployable, I am legally entitled to permanent spousal support. Darren stated, his voice shaking with desperate entitlement. She is the primary earner. She holds millions in Vanguard capital. I am requesting a monthly stipend of $40,000 to maintain the standard of living I was accustomed to during our marriage. I did not scoff. I did not roll my eyes. I simply turned my head and looked at him with the detached clinical curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. Judge Harrison stared at Darren for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. She slowly picked up a thick, bound document from the center of her desk. It was the prenuptial agreement I had forced him to sign years ago, the very document he used to mock. Mr. Cross. Judge Harrison began, her voice dropping to a freezing, lethal register. I have been sitting on this bench for 22 years, and I have rarely seen a display of such profound, unadulterated delusion. Darren flinched, as if he had been physically struck. Judge Harrison opened the document. She did not mince words. She systematically dismantled his entire existence for the public record. She read aloud the specific infidelity clause outlined in our prenuptial agreement, officially entering the digital wiretaps, and his highly public fraudulent affair with Sasha into the court transcript. She explicitly noted the pending federal embezzlement charges hanging over his head, clarifying that his financial ruin was the direct, undeniable consequence of his own criminal actions, not my emotional manipulation. You do not get to steal millions of dollars, commit federal fraud, violate the explicit terms of your marriage contract, and then demand that the woman you betrayed finance your unemployment, Judge Harrison stated coldly. Your request for spousal support is not just denied, it is frankly offensive to this court. Darren's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white, realizing his desperate Hail Mary had just crashed and burned. But Judge Harrison was not finished. Per the ironclad terms of this prenuptial agreement, which you signed of your own free will, I am granting the petitioner 100% of her business assets, her personal accounts, and the entirety of the real estate portfolio, she declared, her eyes locking onto Darren. You are entitled to absolutely nothing. Furthermore, due to the frivolous, bad faith nature of your demands today, I am holding you fully liable for all of the petitioner's attorney fees. Darren slumped back into his hard wooden chair. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He had walked into this courtroom with absolutely nothing, hoping to manipulate the system one last time. Instead, the judge had just legally shackled him to a mountain of my elite corporate legal fees. He had officially achieved a massive, insurmountable negative net worth. There was no secret account to pull from. There was no mother to bail him out. There was no mistress to hide behind. He was drowning in debt he could never ever repay, and he was completely, utterly alone. Judge Harrison picked up her heavy wooden gavel. She did not offer him a single glance of sympathy. She looked directly at me and gave a brief, respectful nod. "This marriage is legally and permanently dissolved," she announced. The gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack that rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. It was the final defining sound of Darren's ruin. He flinched, closing his eyes as the reality of his total destruction washed over him. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without ever looking back, leaving him trapped in the sterile fluorescent light to wait for the federal prosecutors to finish him off. 3 weeks later, the sterile fluorescent lights of family court were replaced by the heavy, oppressive mahogany of the federal courthouse. The air inside the room was thick, suffocating, and charged with absolute finality. I sat perfectly still in the back row of the gallery, wearing a tailored black trench coat, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I was not there to testify. I was not there to seek closure. I was there to witness the end of the line. At the defense tables, the architects of my attempted ruin stood shoulder to shoulder, though they could not bear to look at one another. The arrogant swagger that had defined Darren, Sasha, and Terrence for the past 5 years had been entirely eradicated. They looked hollow, diminished, and terrified. They were completely stripped of their designer armor, standing before the justice system as the common thieves they truly were. Noticeably absent from their lineup was Brittany. She had not even made it to trial. True to my warning, she had fled on that Greyhound bus, desperately taking a brutal plea deal the moment she landed in Florida. The federal prosecutors had shown absolutely no mercy. She avoided a prison cell by a razor-thin margin, but the plea saddled her with a permanent felony record and court-mandated restitution that would aggressively garnish her wages for the rest of her natural life. The woman who used to sip champagne on yachts and sneer at my work ethic was now legally bound to a minimum wage reality in a rural panhandle town, her socialite dreams permanently incinerated. Judge Miller, a stern federal magistrate with zero tolerance for white-collar theft, adjusted his glasses and looked down from the high bench. He did not offer them a lecture on redemption. He offered them the cold, hard mathematics of their greed. "You did not just steal from corporate accounts," Judge Miller stated, his voice echoing loudly through the silent courtroom. "You siphoned money from marginalized communities. You exploited minority grants specifically designed to uplift struggling entrepreneurs, and you used those exact funds to finance luxury vehicles, designer wardrobes, and lavish vacations. Your actions represent the most parasitic, despicable form of corporate greed." Sasha began to hyperventilate. The stoic, untouchable facade she had tried to maintain shattered completely. She gripped the edge of the heavy defense table, her knuckles stark white, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She looked nothing like the woman who had smirked at me during the gala. For the charges of aggravated wire fraud, money laundering, and the deliberate misappropriation of federal grants. Judge Miller continued, never breaking eye contact with her. "I sentence you, Sasha Mercer, to 10 years in a federal penitentiary." A strangled, horrific scream ripped from Sasha's throat. Her knees gave out instantly, and she collapsed against her public defender, sobbing uncontrollably. 10 years, a full decade locked behind concrete and steel. There would be no early release. There would be no glamorous social media comeback. Her youth, her beauty, and her fraudulent empire were gone forever. The judge did not pause for her tears. He turned his unforgiving gaze to Terrence. "For your role in facilitating these fraudulent transfers and masking the stolen capital through illegitimate shell companies," Judge Miller announced, "you are sentenced to 5 years in federal prison." Terrence closed his eyes and hung his head, the reality of his destroyed life finally catching up to him. He would lose his professional licenses. He would lose his freedom. He would lose everything he had helped his brother steal, all because he believed he was untouchable. Finally, the judge looked at Darren. Darren stood rigid. His off-the-rack suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He was already drowning in the insurmountable debt from our divorce. He had already lost his vice presidency, his reputation, and every single asset he thought he owned. Now the government was coming for his time. Darren Cross, Judge Miller, proclaimed, his gavel resting firmly in his hand. You abused your executive power to orchestrate a massive embezzlement scheme. You betrayed your company, your investors, and your community to feed your own bottomless hubris. I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison." The gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp, violent crack signaled the absolute end of the line. Immediately, 2 armed federal bailiffs stepped forward. They moved with mechanical efficiency, grabbing Darren's arms and pulling them sharply behind his back. The heavy metal handcuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists with a cold, unforgiving click. The sound echoed in the silent room, a brutal confirmation that he was no longer a free man. As the bailiffs began to march him toward the heavy wooden doors leading to the holding cells, Darren dug his heels into the carpet. He forced the guards to pause for a fraction of a second. He turned his head, his breathing panicked and erratic, and scanned the crowded gallery. His bloodshot eyes moved past the reporters, past the federal agents, and landed directly on me in the very back row. I did not smile. I did not sneer. I did not offer him a single ounce of gloating or malice. I simply sat there perfectly composed, radiating an aura of absolute untouchable serenity. I looked at him not as a husband, not as a rival, but as a complete stranger. In that final silent exchange, the absolute magnitude of his failure crashed down on him. The delusion completely broke. He saw the beautiful, loyal woman who had genuinely loved him. He saw the brilliant partner who had quietly elevated him. He saw the massive, legitimate empire he could have shared. He realized that in his desperate pursuit of ego and superficial power, he had willingly burned down his own kingdom and handed me the matches. He had traded a lifetime of genuine wealth and absolute security for a cheap illusion that had landed him in federal chains. Darren let out a low, agonizing sound, a primal noise of pure, soul-crushing regret. His shoulders caved inward, his entire body deflating under the crushing weight of his own hubris. "Keep moving," the bailiff ordered, shoving Darren forward. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open and swallowed him whole. The doors slammed shut, sealing Darren, Sasha, and Terrence away from the world. I stood up, smoothed out the front of my trench coat, and walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the city I now owned. 6 months is a very brief period in the grand scheme of a lifetime. But 6 months is an absolute eternity when you are falling from grace. 6 months is an eternity when every single day is a grueling, inescapable reminder of the empire you lost and the prison you built for yourself. Yvonne used to dictate the social calendars of Buckhead. She used to float through country club luncheons draped in heavy silk and expensive pearls. She used to look down her nose at women who worked for a living, convinced her bloodline and her son's fabricated success elevated her above the common reality of the city. She used to believe she was entirely untouchable. She was not untouchable. She was completely erased. Yvonne now lived in a cramped 300-square-foot studio apartment on the deep industrial outskirts of the city. The peeling linoleum floor curled at the edges. The rusted radiator knocked violently in the night. The heavy, suffocating scent of cheap cooking oil lingered permanently in the narrow hallway of her building. She had no savings. She had no safety net. The federal government had seized the accounts her son had fraudulently funded, leaving her with absolutely nothing. At 62 years old, Yvonne was forced to stand for 8 hours a day behind the scuffed register of a brightly lit discount retail store. She wore a stiff blue polyester vest with a crooked plastic name tag. She wore sensible orthopedic shoes that ached by the end of her shift. She wore the permanent visible stain of utter humiliation. The wealthy women who used to drink her imported champagne now occasionally walked down her aisle. They would see her standing behind the register. They would see her ringing up discounted bath towels. They would deliberately turn their heads away. They would pretend she was completely invisible. They did not speak to her. They did not acknowledge her. They treated her like a ghost. Every morning, Yvonne woke up to the reality of her son sitting in a federal penitentiary. Every night, she went to sleep to the reality of her own ruined reputation. It was a prison without bars. It was a prison of her own making. The isolation was absolute. The humiliation was absolute. The defeat was absolute. 500 miles south, the rural Florida humidity was entirely suffocating. Brittany stood behind the sticky laminated counter of a roadside diner, staring blankly out the grease-splattered window. She was sweating through the collar of her faded uniform. She was trapped. She was permanently, legally trapped. Brittany used to carry Hermes bags. She used to sip mimosas on Tuesday afternoons, while mocking the very concept of manual labor. She used to believe she was the smartest woman in any room simply because she had married into stolen money. Now she carried heavy trays of fried food. Now she wiped up spilled coffee for truck drivers who did not look her in the eye. Her massive federal restitution agreement meant that every single meager paycheck she earned was aggressively garnished by the government before she even saw it. The town she had spent a decade desperately running away from was now her permanent holding cell. The local gossips whispered when she walked down the street. They knew exactly what she had done in Atlanta. They knew exactly what she had lost. She had traded a life of manufactured luxury for a life of minimum wage reality. There was no glamorous comeback waiting for her. There was no rich husband coming to save her. There was only the suffocating Florida heat, the endless stack of dirty dishes, and the heavy, inescapable weight of a federal felony record following her for the rest of her natural life. The contrast could not have been sharper. While they drowned in the consequences of their own toxic greed, I stood in the crisp, air-conditioned atrium of a magnificent glass and steel building in the very heart of downtown Atlanta. I stood on a raised, velvet-draped podium. I wore a brilliant, custom-tailored emerald green power suit that commanded the attention of every camera in the room. I held a pair of oversized ceremonial golden scissors. This was the grand opening of the Vanguard Technology Incubator. Sasha and Darren had used the minority community as a prop. They had used marginalized voices as a shield to steal federal grants and fund their fraudulent, parasitic lifestyles. They had taken from the people who needed it most. I was doing the exact opposite. I had fully funded this massive state-of-the-art facility with my own clean, legitimate capital. This building was dedicated exclusively to supporting genuine, hardworking, brilliant minority entrepreneurs who actually built things from the ground up. There were no grifters allowed in my building. There were no shortcuts. There was only real talent and real opportunity. I looked out at the massive crowd gathered before me. Investors, city officials, and dozens of young, hungry innovators looked back at me with genuine respect and admiration. I raised the golden scissors. I sliced cleanly through the wide emerald silk ribbon. The room completely erupted. The applause was deafening. The flashbulbs fired in rapid succession, capturing the exact moment of my ultimate unbothered victory. I had dismantled the parasites who tried to bleed me dry. I had cleansed my life of their toxic presence. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of my power, entirely untouchable. After the press conference concluded, I retreated to the private soundproofed VIP lounge overlooking the city skyline. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water, enjoying the profound, beautiful silence of total success. The heavy glass door opened softly. My executive assistant Chloe walked into the room. She was carrying a massive, breathtaking bouquet of deep velvet red roses. She walked over to my desk with a knowing, quiet smile and set the flowers down gently. Resting perfectly in the center of the dark red petals was a sleek, matte black envelope. I set my glass down and reached for it. I broke the wax seal and slid the contents into my hand. It was not a business contract. It was not a legal filing. It was 2 first-class boarding passes to Paris departing on Friday evening. Attached to the tickets was a small handwritten note on heavy cardstock. The handwriting was bold, elegant, and entirely unfamiliar to anyone from my past. The note contained only 4 words promising a completely new beginning far away from the wreckage I had left behind. The crisp Parisian air carried the scent of freshly baked pastries and rain-washed cobblestones, a stark and beautiful contrast to the humid, suffocating atmosphere of Atlanta. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day. Exactly 1 year ago, I had been sitting in my sprawling Buckhead estate, staring at fraudulent bank statements and realizing that the man I had vowed to spend my life with was actively trying to destroy it. Exactly 1 year ago, I had believed my world was collapsing. I took a slow, deliberate breath and looked out over the wrought iron balcony of the private terrace at Le Jules Verne. The Eiffel Tower dominated the skyline, its golden lights just beginning to flicker against the twilight, casting a brilliant glow over the Seine. I was not sitting in this notoriously romantic city crying over a man. I was not waiting for a text message from a husband who was secretly across town with his mistress. I was not wondering if my financial security was being siphoned away into offshore shell companies by the very people who smiled in my face. I was entirely, completely, and unapologetically free. I turned my gaze away from the breathtaking Parisian skyline and looked at the women sitting around the white marble table with me. When those mysterious first-class boarding passes had arrived on my desk 6 months prior, sent by a fiercely impressed European venture capital firm, aggressively courting Vanguard for a massive international merger, I did not use the second ticket to bring a romantic partner. I used it and purchased 3 more to bring my inner circle. Chloe, my former assistant who had flawlessly managed the chaotic daily fallout of my divorce, sat to my right. She was now the vice president of global operations, wearing a razor-sharp Chanel blazer and radiating absolute competence. To my left sat Elena, the brilliant forensic accountant who had helped me track down every single stolen dime Sasha and Terrence had tried to wash. She was now my chief financial officer. Across from us sat Maya, my fierce lead corporate counsel, the woman who had helped Marcus mathematically annihilate Darren in federal court. They were my fiercely loyal executive board. They were women who had proven their worth through fire, not through proximity to a man's wallet. We were not just celebrating Valentine's Day. We were celebrating the official expansion of the Vanguard Technology Incubator into the European market. We were toasting to our own brilliance, our own strategy, and our own unassailable success. A soft chime broke the gentle hum of our conversation. Maya glanced down at the sleek silver iPad resting next to her crystal water glass. A breaking news chyron from an American legal network flashed across the screen. She read the headline, a slow, highly satisfied smile spreading across her face. She slid the tablet across the smooth marble surface so I could see it clearly. The headline was stark and entirely devoid of sympathy. Disgraced Apex executive Darren Cross denied federal appeal. Sentence upheld in full. I stared at the black text on the bright screen. Darren had spent the last 6 months rotting in a federal holding facility, desperately funneling whatever pennies he could scrape together from sympathetic, misguided relatives to file a massive, sprawling appeal. He had claimed unfair prejudice. He had claimed incompetent counsel, conveniently ignoring the fact that he was forced to represent himself because his assets were rightfully frozen. He had begged the appellate court for a reduced sentence, clinging to the delusional belief that his former status as a tech visionary would somehow afford him a miraculous second chance. The federal appellate judges had read his desperate filing and emphatically slammed the door in his face. His sentence was completely upheld. He would not see the outside of a federal penitentiary for 7 agonizing, unglamorous years. There would be no redemption arc. There would be no second act. He was permanently buried under the consequences of his own monumental greed. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I did not feel the need to gloat or celebrate his misery. Looking at that headline, I felt absolutely nothing for him. He was no longer a threat. He was no longer a factor. He was simply a canceled debt, a closed account, a toxic asset that had been thoroughly liquidated and discarded. I reached out and gently pushed the iPad face down on the table, dismissing Darren Cross from my life for the absolute final time. I picked up my fluted glass, the chilled crystal heavy and perfect in my hand. The champagne inside was a vintage Dom Perignon, pale gold and shimmering with tiny, flawless bubbles. Chloe, Elena, and Maya picked up their glasses in unison, their eyes locked on me, waiting for the verdict on our future. To the empire we built, I said, my voice steady, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. And to the absolute certainty that no one will ever sit at this table who has not earned the right to be here. The 4 of us clinked our glasses together. The delicate musical chime of the crystal was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of genuine loyalty. It was the sound of women who knew their exact worth and refused to discount it for anyone. I took a slow, luxurious sip of the fine French champagne. The taste was crisp, sharp, and tasted exactly like victory. I lowered the glass and turned slightly, looking straight ahead, my gaze piercing the distance and locking directly onto the camera. They say marriage is an investment. They are entirely right. You merge your assets, you merge your time, and you merge your future, hoping the portfolio compounds into something beautiful. But the most profitable financial decision a woman can ever make is knowing exactly when to cut her losses and burn the toxic assets to the ground. The golden lights of the Eiffel Tower flared brightly against the darkening Parisian sky, illuminating a world that belonged entirely to me. The most profound lesson from this story is that true empowerment comes from recognizing your own unassailable worth. When you are surrounded by toxic individuals who exploit your loyalty and drain your energy, the bravest emotional decision you can make is to walk away. You do not need to seek loud revenge. Instead, channel that energy into building your own empire. Authentic success built on integrity and hard work will always outshine the temporary illusions created by greed. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to find your true peace? Share your story in the comments.